Yeah, I mean, first of all, you can tell, every once in a while, Trump will be forced to deliver an actual speech. And you can tell when he's just sort of phonetically mouthing whatever Stephen Miller has put into the teleprompter. He's just like got no energy. He's barely getting through it, font size 80.
First I got your voicemail, then I got you. We can meet in person or maybe on Zoom. So tell me what's your genre, tell me what do you do? I'd like to know the things that specifically make you.
Hello, I'm Tim Barnes. You are the genre. And in every episode of this show, I ask a great new guest about the first genre that inspired them, the first craft that they pursued, and how they feel about that first pursuit now. In this episode, I'm talking to comedian and speechwriter Chandler Dean. I did a show that Chandler co-produces at Caveat, I think, earlier this year, about speechwriting, and it was a great time. And he'd been on my mind since then as someone that I'd want to have on as a guest as the political year of 2024 ramps up. And, you always have those guests in the back burner. And then, after election night, I thought, this is probably the best time to actually fulfill that promise that I had lingering in the back of my mind. Chandler is, as I said, a comedian and speechwriter who is currently a senior director at West Wing Writers. It doesn't mean that he wrote for the show West Wing. It just means that is the name of a writing collective who do speeches for, I think, left-leaning politicians and whatnot. It's some Obama and Clinton writer. He explains it later. And I think you can tell from the flustered nature of this intro that I have been quite flustered in the past week or so. That also explains why this episode is coming out a day later than usual. But anyway, he is a senior director at West Wing Writers, host of the comedy debate show Abolish Everything at Caveat, and a performer at UCB's Herald Night with the team FKA Deb. His work has been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Vulture, McSweeney's, Reductress, and Hard Drive. He is the author of the speechwriting advice column, How to Write Every Speech You'll Ever Need to Give in Your Life. And in 2022, he wrote 2 of the top most read McSweeney's articles of the year. On top of that, he was previously a monologue writer for Love It or Leave It, and has also worked for The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, Late Night with Seth Meyers, and Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. Ultimately, I just really want to talk to him about the future of speeches and to get a sense from him of what we can expect on that front in the next 4 years. And within that, to understand how he has fused comedy with serious speechwriting. With all of that in mind, please enjoy this conversation with Chandler Dean.
If there's anything that I've learned from last night, it's that actually podcasts are where all persuasion happens. So,
Oh, yeah. I don't even know who came out during Trump's speech after. It wasn't even called Just Yet, but it was pretty much everyone knew that he was going to win, and he name checked Joe Rogan, which was somehow shocking to me. I don't know why it was shocking, but it was shocking.
The Joe Rogan thing shocked me less, but then there were what are they called? The Milk Boys, the Milk Boys. There were some boys, the Nelk Boys. I still have not learned what those are, and that
me either. What is
that?
I
need to reckon with being so out of touch with the common man. I don't know who the Nelk Boys are. I knew Theo Vaughn, I knew Joe Rogan, but Nelk Boys, that's on my list. I'm listening and learning.
Yeah, same. And so, before we get into all this, I'm sure we'll be diving into the current state of things quite a bit. But what's the best way to describe what you do now? How do you describe yourself when you're at a party and someone says, "Hey, what's your job? What do you do?"
Well, I am a comedian and speechwriter. For my day job, I work as I'm a senior director at West Wing Writers, which is a speechwriting and strategy firm founded by former Clinton, Obama, and Biden speechwriters, and we write speeches and op-eds and other forms of persuasive writing for all kinds of organizations, philanthropic organizations, corporations, and, cause-based organizations, nonprofits, and then individuals who, basically anyone who doesn't already have a full-time speechwriter, and some people who do rely on us for that. And then outside of that, I do like improv at UCB. I host this show, Abolish Everything at Caveat. I do satire stuff for New Yorker, McSweeney's, and so on. And, and those two things sort of feed each other in an endless feedback loop. And by then the party's now over. If I've explained it in that much detail, but that's how I describe it.
One of the most disturbing things that I ever learned in comedy is that bigger crowds are easier to deal with than smaller crowds. And that's the first time that I started to think about the connection between stand up and political speeches. It really kind of freaked me out when I discovered that.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. I mean, I think that there's an abstraction that you can do with a larger crowd that is harder to do when you can see the individual reactions of a bunch of people. There's also something to be said about, like, if you're in a room of 100 people and 40 of them cheer or laugh, then that feels better than being in a room of 40 people and 20 of them cheer or laugh or whatever it is. It's like, you're more likely to get the reaction that you want from a larger crowd. And then, yeah, when it gets really big, it's like so abstract that, yeah, that I feel like it's way less nerve-wracking, I think, for a lot of people than trying to have a conversation in front of just a few.
It feels like a chicken and egg question that I'm about to ask, and I don't think that's the right that's necessarily the right correlation. But what came first for you, speech writing or stand up?
Well, in high school, when I was applying for college, I think I already knew that I wanted to pursue comedy. I applied for schools in New York, LA, and Chicago, specifically with the hope of like just jumping into comedy scenes there as soon as I arrived. I'm originally from Houston, Texas, so it was going to be a big leap no matter where I went. But what made me want to get into that was definitely, late night shows, specifically, Colbert and Jon Stewart, especially, I think were the ones I most watched religiously starting in middle school. So I was like a political junkie. I did enjoy that kind of satire. And so eventually I went to Fordham in New York starting in 2014, which is when I kind of officially demarcate when I got started trying to do this. And I majored in political science in film and TV, like wanting to develop better my understanding of both of those things, of, yeah, the art of trying to write or perform a joke, and just like getting a better understanding of politics world so as to have a point of view that could be expressed via those jokes, which, yeah, is probably backwards. Yeah, so I kind of vacillated back and forth between political stuff and comedy stuff, like trying to do both in the efforts of like, exploring that specific world of political satire. And so, like, I interned for the Hillary campaign, but also interned for late night shows like Full Frontal and Seth Meyers and Colbert. So that by the time I graduated college, I had some experience in both. And then that's when I applied for the internship at West Wing Writers, which actually has a like small humor practice, they call it, like we're at a law firm, and it's, yeah, nothing more funny than a buttoned up humor practice. That was part of what drew me there, knowing that was part of what they did, and that they've written for, all kinds of different like political comedy events, and like try to make their clients, get laughs in their speeches and that kind of thing. So that's how the two melded. And yeah, and I've been continuing to do both ever since.
That's interesting. So the melding of comedy and politics called out to you in high school. And, you're talking about this concept of the West Wing writers calling it a comedy practice. But you've had throughout your life this interest in finding the official entry into comedy. It doesn't sound like I was going to open mics and stuff. was like I applied to comedy schools at various locations.
Yeah, I mean, well, really, the school thing was just a way of getting to the where the scene was. So I did do open mics, but I mean, I really did actually, yeah. Like, I'd say what resonated more for me was the UCB like improv and sketch classes. It's a little bit more structured than the Wild West of just doing mics and stuff. But I don't know. I mean, don't you think that there is a generation of like homework doing comedians now, where it's like you have to, you know, you have to deliver a certain number of clips and scripts and all
I
of
suppose
like build
so. I didn't
your
really think about
portfolio.
that because in stand up there is this concept of paying your dues and this idea that everyone knows when you have paid enough of them. But I am not privy to, and it's a sign of like there's a dividing line between my age of comedy all of a sudden and the new age of like TikTok and clip rules and stuff. But maybe you're right. There's like a status that you reach of like I've made this many viral sketches or viral stand-up clips. Is that what you mean?
I don't know. I think there's a lot of people who were good at school that are trying to do comedy, and I'm not saying that
I know
is,
you're right.
yeah,
You're
I don't
absolutely
even know if
right.
if I think maybe it's less concentrated in stand up and more concentrated in, again, like these. It makes sense that these like UCB Second City, school systems would attract that kind of person. But I also just think, I don't know, like there's a lot of people who are, if there's an art and science to it, I think there are a lot of folks who are leaning into the science of it now.
You're absolutely right.
Trying to
Yeah,
find
and it's interesting too because there was once like a very clear path towards a type of job, and now late night is fracturing. Lowering the amount of days people are watching it in different ways. So there was a time in which like, oh, the systematic nature of going to this school to showcase all these specific things can get you into this systematic format of the show. But now all of that is in this, in a blender right now. It feels.
Yeah, I think that the pyramid scheme has collapsed effectively. But people are still, yeah, there's still like paths you can climb. But I think that, I mean, this is something that has been well explored at this point. But it is true that just like there was for a time this like comedy middle class, whether it was, performing, like getting past at enough clubs to cobble together enough income to make money off of stand up and do a little bit of touring or whatever, or in the 2010s like all of these websites that were, were like online comedy content
Yeah.
was a somewhat viable as a way to make your money, and now it's like, yeah, like I think your options are get one of these increasingly finite jobs that a handful of gatekeepers are giving, that now there's so few of them they really only have enough room to give them to their buddies, or you can build your own tiny little fiefdom of building a following on your own, again, creating a podcast,
Yeah.
or doing like a Patreon around it or whatever, like finding a way to just set up your own little ecosystem where you like get basically paid directly by your audience to do what you do. And I think there's probably like, I wouldn't be surprised as if you did the numbers that like maybe there's more people than ever doing something that you could call comedy for a living, but so much of it is shaped like what we understand, the life of a, mid-level influencer to be like.
More than that, it feels like almost every type of media making or creativity has been filtered into that into that sphere, which is a little concerning. But it reminds me, my good friend Ian Abramson pointed out a couple years ago when we were like, "What is happening to the industry?" Like right around the strikes, and he pointed out, like, who's really figured out how to handle this new era of it all? It's people who were canceled in the past 5 years previous to this. They have mastered, creating their own fiefdoms, and
Yeah.
now everyone else is catching up with them because of the collapse of these systems.
Yeah, no, I really do think it's easier than ever for people to, without any middleman, reach, a large enough audience. And, you only need like, if you can get like 10,000 people to be like obsessed with you, right? Which is a lot, but like
Yeah.
as compared to getting, as it once was, like tens of millions of people to like you a little bit, then you can make a very healthy living. And also, like, it can be, I feel like it's resulting in comedy or art, if you want to call it that, or, you know, content, if you want to denigrate it, to be just, doesn't have to appeal to almost anyone. It can really only appeal to just the smallest subgroup, and then you can build something off of that. And again, like, I don't know, yeah, not to tie it back, but I'm really, really struck by like the peak of that ecosystem being all of these, you know, pseudo right wing or openly right wing comedians who, you know, just have completely dominated the Spotify charts over the last few years, and evidently have their finger on the pulse of, you know, some
Yeah.
40% of the electorate or whatever.
It's like if you do it well enough, it'll be a big deal whether or not Kamala Harris agrees to do your 3-hour podcast.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and you know, I don't think we can blame any one thing, but it's like, yeah, I don't know. Like, he does reach people that could not be reached by the Democratic Party by any other means. Now, I don't know how easily influenced they would have been,
Yeah.
but it's like, yeah, like, you unfortunately can't just dismiss these things anymore as like, oh, that's on the fringes, or that's like an unserious thing. It's like that has, Joe Rogan has far more impact, I think, than, you know, 60 Minutes does at this stage.
Yeah, and I guess it's weird to consider, you know, the future Ken Burns documentary that's the equivalent of Richard Nixon sweating like crazy during that debate, to a slow zoom on Joe Rogan being like, and then she didn't agree to do his podcast, and that. Uh,
At
but
all.
okay, so this is interesting. I'm going to ask this before I get back into the 3 questions of the show. But talking about comedy in this sort of school manner and your interest in politics on top of that, this election night showed us how you can, on a micro level, dissect a multitude of decisions on a county level, on a state level, on a
Yeah.
national level. And it seems like you like to do this in terms of words as well. Has that always been an interest to you beyond, you know, organizing words into a joke, just like analyzing how people have expressed their thoughts and what made it work in this situation and why not in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is something to be said about, like, when I was a kid, I was, you know, I was good at writing, but also good at math. And I feel like, despite how a lot of other people feel, I feel like they do use a similar part of my brain. Like, I do think that, again, in joke writing, like, I think once you've come up with a concept for a joke, that there does exist somewhere in theory, in the ether, like the
Mm,
perfect number of words and syllables and emphasis to use to like make it pop.
yeah.
And you know, I think that's, I think reasonable people can disagree about that, but I think it's even more true in, you know, traditional persuasive speech writing, where, you know, you're trying to get a point across. You want to do it in as few points as possible. You want to use active language. You want to be evocative. You know, you want your audience to be able to picture and envision in their mind what you're saying without you like necessarily having to spell it out for them. So there's all of these like tips and tricks and strategies that I think can work and that do work across the board. But yeah, I'm trying to remember. I mean, I would say like, I don't know. I know what the questions will be, so I don't want to get too far into the origins of the origins. But I would say probably it was more like, you know, a vague desire to want to do funny things came first. And then over time, I think for me, I have come to realize, like, because I tried everything in college. I tried stand up, improv, sketch, you know, humor writing, every format, and I still do all kinds of it because I just love doing it for fun. But I would say, in terms of what I have been able to identify as like the thing that I jive the most with, it comes most naturally to me. It is like that sort of, you know, like writing with a take, with a point of view, and trying to like, you know, just come up with, all right, what are just the most, the what will in retrospect be the most perfectly logical, you know, procession of jokes to make about this That's why it's like I love writing humor pieces that have like that one premise, and then you just squeeze as much out of it as you can and try to surprise people and try to find it. And I love reading someone else's piece where they come up with a premise that I instantly recognize to be true, and I have thoughts of, oh, what direction would that go? And when they pay that off in like a satisfying but unexpected way, like it just feels to me like elegant in the same way that I imagine, J. Robert Oppenheimer felt after solving a complex equation.
Yeah, it is a very magical feeling, and I often get my mind is often blown when it comes to certain comics, famous comics like Richard Pryor and Bernie Mac, where an added element to the alchemy is not just the words, it's the tonality, like music,
Yes.
and it's the physicality. So one of my favorite writers and comedians is George Carlin. He's just as funny on the page as he is in real life. He can say the exact same words, and I'll laugh reading it and I'll laugh watching it. Someone like Richard Pryor and Bernie Mac on the page, it's hard to tell what the hell is going on.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
They aren't the sentences aren't necessarily complete. It's hard to tell what the intention is. It only makes sense if you add the tone and the physicality. And so, what was, with all that in mind, the first genre that called out to you in your youth? I feel like we've been spiraling around it, but now I want to get specific.
Well, the thing that came to mind is television animation. Felt like really what I glommed onto as a kid. Loved watching cartoons and really loved watching funny cartoons more than anything. Like it took now I can go back and enjoy more dramatic story driven stuff like Samurai Jack and Avatar the Last Airbender and other kids shows that,
Yeah.
were not so focused on that. But I just really loved like the goofiest, like SpongeBob, Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy, Codename Kids Next Door, like goofy, loud, ridiculous concept based cartoons. And then as I got a little older, that transitioned into like The Simpsons and Futurama, which really I think blew the lid off of my brain. And it was The Simpsons that was one, not only as it was for so many people, incredibly, like it shaped my sense of humor and all of that, but it was also through watching the box sets and like listening to the DVD commentaries that I
Yeah.
learned that comedy writing was a job that could exist. And I was just obsessed with hearing them talk about the ways that they came up with the stuff that just felt again so perfect, so like jokes, like a joke that should have always existed but they only like excavated it at that moment. So yeah, I would say it was that, and I think that was very much like when it crystallized to me, maybe around like 11 or 12 years old, that like, yeah, comedy writing is a job that could exist. And I just felt like, yeah, very much in line with the both the sense of humor of the show, those shows really, and the people who made them.
I feel like, The Simpsons, that's a series that I'm sure almost every speechwriter who exists since the since The Simpsons will call back to. Does that come up often among speechwriters?
The notable thing with The Simpsons is, the word coinage they do. Actually, Jersey Gwizdowski, who does the show Vocabulary at Caveat, just did a presentation at our speechwriting show Speakeasy about like this claim that has existed that like The Simpsons is like now the modern day Shakespeare or Bible when it comes to introducing new coined phrases because people reference them so often. And his conclusion is that that is bullshit and that The Simpsons doesn't come anywhere close to Shakespeare and the Bible. But I do think that that was a show that does have a lot of fun, like playing with words. I mean, anytime you've heard someone say, saying the quiet part loud is a big one that like came from The Simpsons. Words like embiggen and cromulent and dough, and all of that. I think there are a lot of ways in which like that phraseology comes through, and it's
Mhm.
also, yeah, such a universal cultural touchstone that like you can reference those characters and situations, and it's something you can generally count on, like, everybody in the room understanding. So yeah, I think to the extent that it's just like such a monolithic piece of culture, and it's very writerly, and it's introduced literal new words and phrases into the lexicon. I have to imagine, yeah, that speechwriters disproportionately love that show.
How similar is speech writing to television writing? Because you're talking like your love of the behind the scenes stuff about The Simpsons. I agree. Yeah, when you are a staff writer in TV show, that is some of the most fun, especially like a sketch show or a narrative show. The balance of like bouncing on top of each other, finding the right moment to say the right thing, this collective discovery of it all. Is there a collective energy to speech writing at all?
Yeah, there can be. I'd say, yeah, obviously the biggest difference is that I do think there's very little correlation between like, knowing how to break a good story and like writing a great speech. I'd say that the process for writing speeches is probably where it's closer to like what you would encounter in a writer's room is like one, I think it is similar ish to a process on like Comedy Variety. If you are, because in that case you are like writing for someone to deliver material as themselves.
Mm,
And especially in some of the shows that have like emerged lately where like the host is like making an argument. I think Last Week Tonight is probably the most speech writerly of the late night shows, where it's like that
yeah.
really is like feels like a nice, well researched essay with jokes sprinkled throughout. And
Can you
so
imagine if presidential candidates had to do a Last Week Tonight style long monologue, like not a speech, but just like making a point with
yeah. Yeah, here's why we should do XYZ. Like your signature policy, you get 15 minutes and a full graphics team to make your case. I mean, I think Pete Buttigieg probably would have gotten the nomination. I think he would probably actually kick ass at that.
yeah.
Or any debate kid would be thrilled with that opportunity. But yeah, I think so there's those ways in which there's a structural comparison, and then in terms of the actual process, I'd say, yeah, in like the initial brainstorming. So, for example, we will get, you know, a client who maybe they know they want to advocate, say, for a certain cause or policy, but they don't have a strong idea of like, all right, how do I hook people into this? Like, what's a story I can tell? What's an anecdote I can share? What's a big, piece of data that I can blow people away with?
Hmm.
Or how can I like rhetorically make this point? And so when you're in the brainstorming phase of like, just like sitting on a Zoom, staring into the abyss, and someone is throwing out, I don't know, what if they did this? Like that does feel very much in line with the writer's room experience. And then even more literally, like some of my favorite experiences at West Wing Writers have been when we are writing something that's like supposed to be funny, start to finish, like, a politician giving a speech at like the Gridiron Dinner in DC, that's a situation where we'll get on the line with like a governor, we'll ask them like what are the topics that you want to hit, and then we'll just like sit around in a room later and like go through all the topics, draw the unexpected connections, and try to
Hmm.
come up with like what could this person say about this and this, and in sort of a there are no bad ideas, free form environment. And then you get to have that big brainstorm that then someone takes away and chisels down into something coherent. Like all of that to me does feel like a lot of the skills overlap.
Do you feel that in the speech writing world that there is a shift similar to the red map we saw on every special TV screen that these statisticians have on these cable networks? Like, does someone like Trump becoming, in the second term, someone who speaks in a pattern very unique
Right.
among politicians? Do you feel like something is will potentially like degrade in some way in the formality of speeches up until a moment like this?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, you can tell, every once in a while, Trump will be forced to deliver an actual speech. And you can tell when he's just sort of phonetically mouthing whatever Stephen Miller has put into the teleprompter. He's just like got no energy. He's barely getting through it, font size 80.
Yeah.
And, he's just so much less comfortable than when he's just out there riffing. But which makes me wonder, like, what if he did do a State of the Union like one of his rallies? Like,
Oh
how
my
would that
God.
go?
How? I
But
mean, he's got the he's got the Senate and the
yeah,
House,
he's got the
so
full mandate. He can do whatever he wants. Like, um,
you can
might as
have
well have
Tony
some fun.
Hinchcliffe warm up. Uh,
The first ever opener for the State of the Union. Yeah, that would go over awesome.
I
But
also feel
yeah,
like that's a bit of the secret power to Donald Trump too, is that when he says something in a formal, stilted way, it's kind of a reverse dog whistle, I suppose, where his core weirdo fanatics, like the weirdest that we can imagine, they know like, oh, he's just doing this for the man, but we know
yeah,
when the real Donald Trump shines.
yes.
So
And
when
then
he,
the
in a
the New
very
York
stilted
Times
way, says,
headlines are
"I
like,
believe that Barack Obama was born in Hawaii." Uh,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
No, definitely. And then the headline is like a surprisingly credulous Trump rises to the occasion and it's like, oh my God, like he's playing you guys like a fiddle. Yeah, no, totally. That well, it's like that whole, dichotomy, take Trump literally not seriously or vice versa.
yeah,
Where people have just been able to be like, oh, all the stuff he says that I don't like, he's lying about, and all the stuff that he says that I do like is what he actually believes. And I think that you saw that play out again, like, this sort of, well, he's not going to deport my family. He's going to deport the family I don't like down the street. And it's like, that is just the inherent, like, what he is a human Rorschach that has truly managed to, yeah, people have been able to just project all kinds of hopes
yeah.
and dreams on him in a way that kind of made sense in 2016 when he was a relatively unknown quantity. And I think what's so baffling to people right now is like, we know what he actually did, but like,
Yeah.
there's so many people who seem to have either memory hold it or just remember,
It is weird. I
the
guess in
dollar
a
menu and
sense that
stick
does
with
make
it.
him the purest politician in a way. And he
Yeah.
does seem like, how they'll set up like, oh, this Twitter account is fully made out of AI, and within minutes it gets super racist. He does,
Yes.
he does just kind of feel like a biological version of that.
Yeah. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards slurs.
Yeah.
Sure. Um,
Don't scroll away. You Are the Genre. We'll be right back after the break. Here we are in the middle of the show where I remind you that You Are the Genre is an independently produced and listener-supported podcast. If you'd like to support it in any way, there are a few ways you can do it. You can simply subscribe to the podcast and give it a nice rating or review. If you're into subscribing, there's also a newsletter connected to the podcast. You can find a link to that in your show notes or at youarethegenre.com. You can select a free subscription to the newsletter, but if you upgrade to paid, you get advanced episodes, other exclusive goodies, plus the simple joy of knowing that you are supporting the podcast financially. I typically use this break in the middle of the show to talk about something that I've simply been enjoying, and honestly, it's not much off the top of my head. But I suppose in a way to kind of tee things up for what we have lying ahead of us in 2025, I recently rewatched the 2018 HBO movie Fahrenheit 451. And if you know me, you know that I love Ray Bradbury, even though I sometimes call him Ray Bradbury. And I remember watching this when it came out, but it definitely hits different when you watch it again. They took some modern liberties to the story that I think fit, and it's worth considering where certain things will escalate. So I recommend both reading Fahrenheit 451 and watching this movie because it's probably the best adaptation on screen of Fahrenheit 451 that exists. It's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good. So there you have it. Watch the 2018 HBO Fahrenheit 451. Leave a nice rating and review to the You Are the Genre podcast, and consider subscribing to the newsletter. If you'd like to do that last thing, get all of the information you need at youarethegenre.com. Now, back to the episode. Where were we?
But yeah, anyway, as far as the speechwriting goes, I would say I do think Trump is a little bit of an anomaly, but I do think after 3 election cycles in a row where he's overperformed, I honestly think you could see a Democrat try to emulate the sort of, because I do think that Kamala lost in part on authenticity, right? There's that political cartoon that sums it up very well, which is like a sheep pointing at a billboard being like, I like how he tells the truth. And it's a wolf saying, I will eat you. It's like, I really feel like that is so much of his appeal is that people perceive him as being authentic, even when he's authentically saying awful things. And so, you already see it with like AOC on her Instagram live comms, right? Like those are not scripted. She rarely delivers like fully scripted remarks. She's often speaking off the cuff, and I do think appeals to people that way. But I do think that there will still always be room for people to say, hey, this is the sort of thing that people want to hear. These are the phrases that resonate, and so I do think there will always be room for some kind of comms in that regard. And also these people, not everybody, I don't know if you would call what Trump does a product of talent, but not everybody is talented enough to speak off the cuff at, multiple events a day, in that regard. I think that so long as the stump exists and, people have to go to that many events, then there will need to be someone, if only for the functional reason of like, someone has to know, like, who am I supposed to thank at this rally, right? Who's the elected official that showed up that I have to thank? That's the bare minimum. But I also think there's a lot of value in, in coming up with the ways to persuade people and, just like memorable moments that are hard to guarantee if you're off the cuff. So, and even then, like, if not that, then tweets, and if not that, then essays, and if not that, then any other form of persuasion.
Yeah, so it's possible that the future of speech writing is writing memorable bullet points for a politician to hit.
I think there are some people who already do that. There are some CEOs, politicians who never read off of a set of remarks, but yes, do rely on those kinds of bullet points. We do that already, and the money is the same. So what
Okay,
difference does it make?
that's good to know. Yeah, so the legacy of the BuzzFeed list continues.
Yeah.
Your interest in television animation, what did that spark inside of you? Like, what were you? Did that specifically spark you telling jokes to your friends, things like that?
I think it was just like I think I was like weirdly, because everybody watched cartoons as a kid, but I do think that I was weirdly obsessed with like the mechanics of it from a very young age. Like I remember like looking up, how many episodes of Dexter's Laboratory are there, and how did that break down into the seasons? It was like, oh, there's 6 seasons, there's 13 episodes each. Like, why do they do that? Like the process behind it fascinated me at a young age, which I think was unusual. So then again, like between that and like going into the Simpsons and stuff, like, becoming more aware of it from a sort of logistical side, like, made me really interested in that as a career, which like, eventually morphed into, the more comedy variety like area. But also, yeah, like for example, it was a lot of like copycat stuff. Like I loved like reading Captain Underpants. And so I did my own, comics in the style of George and Harold and tried to sell them at school for 25 cents or whatever. And, like came up with like ideas for cartoons and like drew all kinds of different characters and stuff. But I think that I was always like the part of it that was the most interesting to me was like, yeah, the writing element of it less than the illustration part of it, because I quickly realized that I was a really terrible cartoonist. Like I could not draw, but I liked the idea of creating the worlds and the ideas. And, like I remember my mom tells me that at one point I was like I can't ever make a animated show because I can't draw, is what I told her when I was like, like 10 or something. And she was like, you can get other people to do the drawings. And I was like, holy shit. And so while I don't, that's not necessarily the path I'm on right now. It is still like, it distills like, that was the fun part of it for me was the writing bit.
Nice. And I feel like that's another way to illustrate that split between the physical element of presenting a joke and the purely text element of presenting a joke. And so that kind of revealed to you like, oh, maybe the text side is perfect for me. And so that evolved into your love of political comedy. And with that in mind, what would you say the first craft was that you pursued? Was it that moment where you were applying for these different comedy institutions, et cetera, like being a professional comedian or comedy writer? Which one was it?
I mean, so honestly, before that, I like once I kind of abandoned the illustrations thing, but I was still wanting to make stuff. What I pivoted to in like middle school and high school was making YouTube videos in like the early days of YouTube. And that was like a bunch of just like really dumb, sketches with my friends, some like song parodies and trailer parodies and that kind of thing, all extremely derivative of like The Lonely Island and
Oh
also
god,
whatever
yeah.
else was on YouTube
But the internet
at
was
the time.
young.
Yes, exactly. If you could, I really do think if I had been a little more committed to a consistent release schedule, I easily could have been the 1000th most successful Lonely Island ripoff, and have live on a yacht somewhere as a result of that level of success. But yes, so that was kind of how I channeled it for a few years, and again, it just like slowly evolved over time where I was like, I think that I just really got in my mind that it would be so cool to, be a part of this like political comedy stuff that I was like watching on TV, and like some of the songs that I was doing, I was like getting more like topical with it. And again, it was all very silly and dumb. I did, and again, talk about ripoffs. Like Jib Jab had their year in review videos. I like ripped that off for a little bit, and did my own. And so it all just sort of, yeah, slowly started developing. But that was the medium through which I did it. Then that eventually evolved into, I would say it was like, you know, cartoonist to YouTube video creator to comedian to comedy writer who, I still, go out and perform. But I really do think that, yeah, if I had to narrow it down to like, what is the thing that I feel like I've developed the most over time, like that would be it.
What is it?
Oh, comedy writing specifically is
Comedy writing.
where it's
Okay.
landed. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so this is actually the best time to ask the the last question of the show, but perhaps before that to also talk about this correlation between politics and comedy as it's evolved over the past 20 years or so. And we've gotten to some interesting full circle moments with someone like Jon Stewart leaving the Daily Show and returning, this concept of a political satirist. Is that the right way to say the word? Satirist?
Satirist. Yeah.
Who always had the refrain when a particularly tough question came. Well, I'm just a comedian.
Yeah.
Uh, what's going on with what's going on with it now? Because there is like even with Donald Trump, he has. If there's anything that you could say is brilliant about him, it is his cadence. His cadence. It's one of those things where when I used to go to open mics and stuff a lot, there's a point where you kind of stop paying attention to the particular words of a joke because you're hearing so much of them.
Yeah.
And you just know when to laugh because of the sounds.
Yes.
And Donald Trump has has the sounds. If you kind of mute the words but you keep the rhythm, it sounds funny and he knows
Yes.
that. And perhaps we're seeing a rise of right wing comedy style, if that if that makes any sense. And I don't even know. I think I saw a trailer for a Daily Wire political comedy movie where it was the reverse of what you typically see of like some a liberal going undercover to reveal weird things about people on the right, to someone on the right doing that.
Right.
There's a topsy turviness happening right now, and I wonder if you have any thoughts or an analysis on that.
So yeah, there's a few things. First of all, the like meme. There was a meme for a while, of I think maybe I don't know if Charlie Kirk said it first, but the claim of like the right is getting better at comedy and it's making the left nervous. And you look at the comedy and it's just like the thousandth like they them joke that has ever been made. Um, However, I fear that like while I don't think that orthodox, conservatives, like actual right-wing operatives are funny yet, I do think that there's been this like there's all of these comedians who, like you say, like talking about how getting canceled is a boon for building your own like audience in alternative media. Like some people got canceled, some of them just didn't ever get greenlit. They were not funny in traditional funny spaces, so they go and they do something where there's no gatekeepers, and they make their podcast or whatever, and like slowly build an audience. And I feel like in a podcast, or lots of other forms of media, you can get away with just like having sentiments that people agree with, and that resonates with an audience, and you don't have the pressure of like actually telling a joke that actually triggers a large group of people in a room to laugh. If you just like resonate with someone one on one, like you've earned your listener. And so I think that there's a lot of folks who there's also just more money, there's more upside potential in it at the end, because there's an theoretically infinite number of people that you could get to download your podcast and hear the ads for dietary supplements that you're hawking.
Similar things happening in like the nerd commentary element of it all, like just using Star Wars as an example, or all these where that people are going to click on something that is saying like I hate this new version of this Star Wars show because of woke blank blank, that kind of thing. And
Yes.
it's part of the system, because you're trying to make the most money, and you might not even truly care about what you're talking about, but because you can make this specific talking point to get people riled up, you do it.
Yeah, no, I think that there's so much that you can get from just like airing grievances and building an audience. So then what you have now is all of these people who have enormous audiences that are ostensibly comedians, but what they spend most of their time doing is just like complaining that there's too many black people in commercials now or whatever else. Why they always got to be interracial in this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so like there's just so there you have that big audience. And then what you have at the same time is the collapse of traditional media, where again, like these 60 minutes type platforms, or all of these newscasters that have shows. Like it used to be that like by far the biggest audience that you could get if you were a political figure, or someone of importance, was to go on one of these like legitimate shows that had certain like rigorous like journalistic standards. And so there was a trade-off of like, well, yeah, I might get grilled by this person, but also I'm going to get to give my message to such a wide audience. So it's a worthwhile trade. Now there's just it's also fractured that like you can go on all kinds of really friendly outlets, or even if they're not friendly, just like not that intellectually elevated of a conversation. And so the distinction then between journalists and podcasters and comedians, I think, becomes less and less and less, because I don't think that audiences are really distinguishing, especially if they're just like watching clips on TikTok where, Don Lemon is running around Howard University with a microphone asking people who you going to vote for. Like he's not asking gay son or thought daughter, but it's the same like structure
Yeah.
of just like, I'm wandering around with a phone following me around. It's like, okay, so what difference does it make? If Jon Stewart calls himself a comedian, he's a guy with an audience who can persuade people one way or the other. It's like he doesn't get to decide if he has what responsibility he has. It's all become flattened.
Yeah.
And it's just about whether he chooses to accept that responsibility. But I think it's totally fair game to ascribe him just as much of a duty to do that as anybody else who gets like a few million views on videos consistently.
Yeah, and so that ties into the odd power of someone like Joe Rogan right now. And so for the final question of the show, where it's about reflecting on that first pursuit, how do you feel about that specific pursuit of like wanting to write comedy for a show like The Daily Show, etc.? And parallel to that, if you were in high school now, would you have that same interest, or would it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is something I think about all the time. I have likened the pursuit of trying to write for late night right now as like dreaming of being like a magazine columnist, right? It's like this is a job that is disappearing if it even really still exists in a meaningful way at all. And yeah, I'm absolutely just like there's a way in which I'm chasing it just because that's what, the people I looked up to as a kid got to do. And that was the path that existed then. And I think we see, but the thing is that like the people who wrote for, classic Daily Show, they didn't dream of writing for the
Yeah.
Daily Show.
Yeah.
I don't know what they would, whether they dreamed of maybe it was the Tonight Show, or maybe it was just like doing comedy in a vague way, and that's what they stumbled upon. But it's like, now the people who do the really revolutionary stuff are the people who like stumble into something new that then by the time, there's enough time that passes for a kid to watch it and then grow up and try to do it. Like obviously by the time that someone like me, if I do land one of those jobs, which I am still relentlessly available for, I it just won't be the same as it was 10, 20 years ago. And that doesn't mean it's not something that would still be exciting and fun to do.
Yeah.
But really, I think that there's a higher likelihood that I would have people, if I was like, where could I land where I could get kids to look up to me? Like, probably at this point, it would need to be something where, where I am, like doing something on YouTube or TikTok that just has its own independent audience. That's where the young viewers are now. They are not watching cable television.
Yeah.
Maybe they're watching clips of cable television, but it's like, why bother with the middleman?
I feel like that's what's so funny about people like us, our age, with that specific interest is like, of course, you can make the YouTube channel, but it's not the simple fact that it's not the thing that you grew up caring about.
Yes. Yes.
Like there are young people who could care about it in the exact same way that you cared about the Daily Show in high school, but it would mean,
well, dude, I mean,
yeah, means nothing to you.
Just think about how Conan was like myopically obsessed with hosting the Tonight Show.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like in 2009, anybody who was like paying attention to that battle, like sympathized with him and was like, anyone who was a fan of him at the time, like understood where he was coming from because the cultural context was so recent of like what the Tonight Show meant as an institution. Fast forward like just a few years, and again, it's all just YouTube clips.
Yeah.
Nobody knows the difference between the Tonight Show, the Late Show, the Late Late Show, After Midnight. It's like, oh, they're on TV, right? Like it's and even that, it's like, no, they're on a clip on my phone.
Yeah.
And like I feel like if we can give ourselves some grace, if literally the generational talent of his time, Conan O'Brien, like I think suffered from, ultimately everything worked out great for him, right? But it's like he had to go on his own sort of, journey. I think, I don't know, I can't speak for him, but I would have to imagine that he is probably happier and more satisfied and more well-adjusted now than he's ever been in his career with his extremely successful podcast.
Yeah.
And
he's adapted so perfectly, and he'll probably be around enough to see it swing back to what it once was. And I'm still recovering. I think I'm finally in like the last stages of recovering from the ripple effects of him just not having a television show anymore. That last episode of Conan on TBS affected me more than I thought it
Yeah.
would. And it was because that was such a specific goal of mine to either write for it or to do a stand-up set on it.
Yeah.
And so much so that even when I got to write for a late night show, I got to write for the Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. It was like, oh, this is not the version of the thing that I grew up wanting. Therefore, this is an odd experience for me, because I'm serving the YouTube algorithm more than I ever cared to, I guess, was what it was for me.
Yeah. I mean, the closest that I have come to a job like that is I wrote monologue jokes for Love It or Leave It on like a freelance basis. And like, it was awesome. Like, it was like, it felt so good every time I like wrote a new joke. And I was like, I am getting paid to do
Yeah.
this. It's just like, I was like freaking out about it. But yeah, of course, it's like, but it's like, you zoom out and I'm like, okay, but I'm writing jokes for a podcast question mark. It's a live show turned into podcast. Like, it's so, yeah, it is
Yeah.
like an
The
uncanny valley
value
way
systems are
different.
so nebulous now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, but yeah, so like I think that I don't know. To me, it's comforting to think that like even among the most successful people, most of them, just by the nature of how entertainment shifts, almost nobody gets to do exactly the thing that they dreamed of. They stumble into, if they're really fortunate, they stumble into something different that itself is really cool and that somebody else will see as like, oh my God, that's the dream. And, then they continue to just like lay awake at night being like, what if, what if I had gotten, XYZ thing that no longer exists?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I feel like you've done a good job of summarizing why I created this show. And something I often think about, especially with all of the weird things that people like have done over the past decade with the rise of new media, which seems like it's been around long enough to be old media now. I think about some of those like biographies and old interviews with comedians where they're talking about writing jokes on some Campbell's Soup radio hour that no one remembers, and some segment in a newspaper that no one really recalls or whatever. I try to remind myself that these little things that we're doing now will someday sound interesting enough. Like even when I hear about those things from, I'm never really going to look up this Campbell Soup thing or whatever
Mm.
this newspaper segment was, but it sounds exciting because it feels like, oh, you're engaged in the hustle of doing whatever. And it's ideal when you're saying those things cushion between like a really big exciting thing afterwards. I was like, oh yeah, I was making odd money writing jokes for, Waze or whatever.
Yeah.
And then I landed this thing. Yeah.
I also just feel that way about just, I don't know. I try to really appreciate and soak in just the lifestyle of just going for this, right? Like, I think that there will surely come a day when I look back and I'm like, I'll be yearning for the days of running from a poorly attended show at UCB to a poorly attended show at Caveat and, just like getting up on stage and doing random stuff, like just the I don't know. I feel like so many people consider doing something like this, or have in the back of the mind that they should try it, and either they wait a really long time before they even give it a shot and feel like they fell behind, or just never actually pursue it. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's something to be said about like the value of just like, even if it is like, yeah, piecing together a bunch of like crocheting together a beautiful patched blanket of various small to medium to big accomplishments of varying lengths, like I just think that the final result is, a lot of like, memories that we will hopefully cherish, even if, in the midst of doing it we were always looking forward to the next thing. I just try to like take some time to soak it in and appreciate it every once in a while.
Nice. Well, I see why they pay the big bucks to write speeches. Do you write speeches in a bipartisan manner, by the way? Like, do you write speeches for people that are like diametrically opposed to your values? Does that ever happen?
Not diametrically, but no, I would say that it's more like a sort of, you know, sometimes I strongly agree with the cause. Sometimes I am, neutral about whether this new cell phone is, a revolution to society. But it's like, yeah, by nature, since we are sort of a partisanly affiliated firm, yeah, we don't get any work where it's like someone diametrically opposed. I'd say the closest thing is like, you know, there's this old school in the old days of like, like I said, like the Gridiron Dinner, White House Correspondents' Dinner, the Al Smith Dinner, like all of these like, political events where Democrats and Republicans would get together and tell jokes. I do think there used to be a culture of like, swapping jokes and stuff across parties, and like, there was like that, like speechwriters from one party could, had a lot in common with speechwriters from the other and would be friends and, hang out after the events and things like that. I just think, unfortunately, we are in a place now where just like doing absolutely anything that would remotely help the image of someone in the Republican Party. I don't know. I kind of, my whole ethical belief system is kind of built around the notion that the Republican Party is ontologically evil at this point, unfortunately. So I can't do it myself. But yeah, so usually we're batting for one team.
Well, nice. Well, I had a great time at your show at Caveat, and thank you so much for joining me on You Are the Genre. This has been a
You were terrific.
true
Yeah, thank you
pleasure.
so much for doing that, and I'm so glad to have done this.
Big thanks to Chandler Dean for joining me on the podcast. For more information about him, visit Chandler.com. And it's not spelled Chandler in total. It's spelled in a very internet way. CHNDLR.com. Freddie Nunez created and sings the You Are the Genre theme song, and Adam Smith produced it. This is Tim Barnes signing off with your weekly reminder that you are the genre.
First I got your voicemail, then I got you. We can meet in person or maybe on Zoom. So tell me what your genre, tell me what do you do? I'd like to know the things that specifically make you